Deirdre, I have been really looking forward to this. Just to be able to meet you, to record your story, to learn from you. Thank you so much for giving me the time. It's wonderful to meet you and welcome to the show.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I'm here, so to speak. I'm in Chicago in my loft apartment downtown, but by the magic of Zoom,
Here we are.
here we are.
I wanted to start with a quote from your book, Crossing, which I
Yeah.
have been rereading over the last couple of days. And this is it. I visited womanhood and stayed.
Mhm.
It was not for pleasures, though I discovered many I had not imagined, and many pains too. But calculating pleasures and pains was not the point. The point was who I am.
Mhm.
I've been doing this podcast now for more than a year, and this will be close to the 60th episode. I have yet to have someone on who has gone through a life like yours, who has transitioned. And just as a person, I have been extremely interested and curious to go there and to document a story like yours. And there are a few people that I think can better articulate that in a manner that is eloquent and informed and reflective and civil as you. So I'd love to start maybe by the beginning of getting the beginning of your story from when you were young. And I guess I would start by you know making a note of what you say at the very beginning of your book Crossing, which is that in the very early stages of your boyhood, you were very much a boy.
Sure.
You were interested in boyish things. You were interested in trucks and warfare.
Well,
And then something changed. And I'd love to maybe start by just giving you an
well,
opportunity to remember that
I've
beginning.
kind of I've thought about it. I haven't ever been psychoanalyzed or depth psychology or anything about it, but as far as I can remember, I was interested in some boyish things, but not the usual group of boyish things. For example, I grew up in Boston. My father was a big Red Sox fan,
Mm.
and yet I didn't ever have the what so many of my male friends have uh, a, a boyhood filled with baseball statistics.
Yeah.
Uh, um, George Will, for example, is a crazy Chicago Cubs fan and knows everything about the Cubs. By the way, I have a cousin who was a for 1 year was a pitcher for
Mm.
the Chicago Cubs in the 1920s. Uh, so, and I I was never aggressive the way some boys are. I can remember in my boyhood one fight, and that a not very serious one. My best friend Joey, who lived down the street, for some reason I can't remember, we got into a tussle, but that's all it was.
Mm.
Whereas there are some boys who, they fight,
Yeah. Yeah.
and like John Wayne, they claim to enjoy it. So I didn't. So I've looked back and tried to say, well, was there something feminine about me? Maybe there was, but in any case, starting around age 11 or so, as puberty came on, I I started to cross dress, as lots of men do occasionally, and thank God I wasn't ever caught. I was born in 1942, so if I'd been caught in 1943 dressing in women's clothes, my mothers say, um, they would have, that's really a dangerous time to be queer.
Yeah.
They were giving boys with homosexual tendencies, which I never had, uh, electric shock therapy in the 1950s to shock them straight.
Yeah.
So, thank God. So I was normally attracted to girls, and married the love of my life, 1965, and was married for 30 years, had two children, but always occasionally out cross dress. And I thought of myself, standard category that the psychiatrist worked out. I thought of myself as a heterosexual crossdresser. And you'd be surprised at how many men crossdress. I mean, it's not everyone, but it's quite common. Amazingly, in my experience, engineers are particularly inclined to be cross-dressers. Don't ask me why. Maybe it's some sort of sampling problem I'm facing. Anyway, but then in 1995, early in 1995, through the beginnings of the internet, I discovered discussion groups of cross-dressers. And I discovered from them that practically everywhere has a cross-dressing club where guys meet at the local Holiday Inn. I'm not making this up. And they get dressed and then they go home. And after about 8 or 9 months of that, I got it, that I wasn't a heterosexual cross-dresser. I wanted to, as the quotation you read said, go to Venice or go to Paris and stay.
Yeah.
So it was I just saw a TV biography of Bill Clinton, and Clinton was the son of an alcoholic. His stepfather, Clinton.
Yeah.
And they say, the commentator said, as the child of a alcoholic, you're concealing something. You're repressing it. It's the only way a child can handle this terror of a violent father, gets drunk and beats up on his mother. So there was, in that respect, there was this suppressed secret part of me. The only person in the world who knew was my wife. So anyway, that's the brief story. So then in August of 1995, I twigged, as the British say. And
if we can, I would love to back up maybe and
sure.
talk about, your earlier life, because I know one of the, interesting pieces of information that I learned in doing research for this conversation is, you were, I think you were the high school quarterback of your football team.
I wasn't I was the captain. I didn't have the skills to be a quarterback. I was a lineman. Very in an emergency, I think I could still do a crossbody block. But it would have to be a hell of an emergency.
Fair enough. You were born Donald.
I was.
You 1942. In 1942. And, I know just in my personal life from one of my closest friends when I was growing up, also in the Midwest and sort of right on the Pennsylvania-Ohio border, he was gay, knew he was gay, concealed it from everyone. This is not that long ago, but it really is culturally. It's amazing how far we have come in general.
Astonishing.
The perspective of how we treat and think about gay people. But in learning the truth about his own story, he knew from a very early age that this is who he was. He was dating women. He was trying to date women, but meeting up with men in secret. And for you, when you are, young and going through puberty, just personally, did you already said this in this conversation that you married the love of your life.
I did.
Physiologically, just personally, were you attracted always to women, or what was the self-awareness like in your early, puberty years?
A 12 or 13-year-old is not very self-aware unless he or she is unusually perceptive.
Yeah.
And I was not especially. So no, people can do many things at once. They can be operating at this level or this way in one way and doing it in some other way. So I, in other words, humans can compartmentalize, thank God.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. I was not there. There are some trans people, male or female. By the way, they seem to be about equal in numbers. It's not people assume that it's males going XY people going to being or performing as X people um, is what it is, but that's not true. There appear to be equal number of females to males as males to females. It's just easier to do it female to male and harder to detect. And I have a male voice, alas, and I'm big. So the other day I was standing in a line in an airport, and I was read by the couple in front of me. I could tell that they knew I had once been a man.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, but I was attracted to girls, women, and always was. Unlike Bill Clinton, I was not a super stud, I have to say. but I was very, very heterosexual. Still am. Although since my change, I haven't had any sexual experiences at all, which is fine with me because sex is a hell of a distraction, as you may have noticed in your own life.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
Look, people want people to be simple. Are you gay? Are you this? Are you French? Are you a lawyer? They want people to be one thing. And most people aren't. I think all people are multiple.
Yeah.
We're all the children of our parents. We're all the parents of our children. We're all mixed things.
Yeah. And I think we will get to this in this conversation because I know you write about this in your book as well, that the decision to change eventually in your early 50s in part was done because you're a free person who can do what you want.
Yeah.
During the courtship with the woman who would become your wife, was there a discussion between the two of you about your tendencies? Were you intentionally concealing information from her? How did you go about that?
I was not, how can I put it? I didn't feel guilty about concealing it. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. Because I didn't regard it as central to who I was.
Yeah.
Put it that way. Whereas by now, I do feel it's central to who I was, but it took me to the age 53 to kind of get that. Again, this ability to suppress and to double and treble track that people have. No, I didn't think it was that big a deal, honestly. And in the third month of our marriage, I told my wife, and we cried about it. But we rather quickly developed what is the practice of the great majority of heterosexual crossdressers, which is that it's no big deal.
Yeah.
It's something, men, as women know, men have a lot of sexual peculiarities that don't really amount to very much. Foot fetishes and this and that. Now, some of them are, like being attracted to children and so on. That's not so nice, but that's not harmless. But this was, and I didn't do it in front of her. I didn't ever do it in front of her. But when she was away, I'd sometimes do it. And neither of us thought of it as a big deal.
Yeah. When you say after 3 months, you talked to her about it.
Yeah.
What is it? What did you confess? What did you talk about?
I sometimes dress in women's clothes and masturbate and so on. And she was a nurse, so she had a certain amount of sophistication, but she came from a small town in Vermont, so she was not super clued in. But, it was 1965 we're talking about, so no one was clued in then.
Yeah.
The psychiatrists knew nothing about it. They were shockingly ignorant on the basis of no science at all.
Yeah.
And that kept going for decades afterwards.
Yeah. You've alluded to this, that, the 90s were a different time, the 80s are a different time, the 50s and 60s were
Oh boy.
even harder. And
Well, to be unusual in any way, to be a communist, to be I don't know, to be almost anything, being a woman, not unusual, but still, to be gay, to be foreign, to be anything in the 50s was very nasty.
yeah, I have to imagine that the compulsion to want to do that must have been extraordinarily strong.
Well,
Given the knowledge that, the conformity was so
yeah, but
enforced.
it was strong, but that's true of lots of our desires. I mean, my desire to have this very good chocolate covered ice cream they have across the street is in my neighborhood is really very strong. And I just had two of them for lunch. So, we it's not unusual to be driven by various kinds of compulsions.
Yeah.
People do all kinds of good things and bad things with this kind of it's you're in its grip. A friend, Michael Csikszentmihalyi, a famous psychologist, a positive psychologist and academic, he spoke. He died a couple of years ago. He spoke of flow, the psychological state of doing something that you're just able to do. It's not beyond your competence, but you're able to do it, and you're absorbed in it entirely. And he calls that happiness. And things we do that are good or bad for us, or good or bad for other people. When Che Guevara killed his first man, he sent a letter to his father. Che was a doctor.
Yeah.
And described to his father how wonderful he felt. Well, that's flow. And that's the feeling that everyone has sometimes.
Yeah. And for yourself, when you would participate in this, right? When it was often in secret, you mentioned Holiday Inn already during this conversation too.
Yeah.
Was it that for you? Was it a state of flow? Was it more of just was it arousing the
It was arousing. It was arousing until, very interestingly, in the spring of 1995, it stopped being arousing. Maybe not the spring, the summer. Once I twigged, as I keep using that English expression, once I realized that I could change and would, it stopped being sexually arousing, which is interesting. I don't know quite why, but and so it was about sex, about masturbation, but you can tell by the outcome, decades after, that it was more than that, more than just physical, we say.
Yeah. I think one of the things, just for me as a student of your story, is that is different from, I think, a lot of the trans stories that we hear about today, is the age at which you decided to do this. You had lived an entire life of a multi-decade marriage. Well, you had been a father.
That's because things, as you said before about homosexuality, things have radically changed. But in places like the United States or Britain, France, about society's attitudes towards trans people. I mean, still, even in 1995, when I started to transition, it was unusual enough to be on the front page of the Des Moines Register. Professor at the University of Iowa changes gender. There were a number of stories. Now it wouldn't raise a ripple.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the course of conversation, I sometimes reveal that I was once Donald, and people say, oh, gee, that's interesting. How about those Yankees? They don't care anymore. Whereas they very much cared in 1995, and even more so for the real pioneers. I was early on, but the real pioneers were the people like Jan Morris, the English journalist and writer, or actually Welsh journalist and writer, who transitioned in the 1970s.
You've noted this already as well, that you were attracted to your wife. You'd always been attracted to women.
Mm-hmm.
Those decades, as you think back on your marriage, your fatherhood, at the beginning of the first chapter of the book, there is a picture of you, I think probably in your 40s or 50s, a bearded
Sure.
Donald.
Sure.
When you think back on those decades now, how do you think about them? Was it a happy marriage? You've used the word suppressed many times. What do you reflect
No. On the
that?
contrary, no. I've always been a basically cheerful person. I'm an optimist. From the time I was very young, I stuttered. I still stutter in some circumstances, I was a kind of golden boy. I went to Harvard College. My father was here's what I say nowadays. I should get tremendous credit for choosing my parents, because I chose very well. My father was a professor at Harvard. My mother was an opera singer. So, boy,
not bad.
Is she clever to do that? And so I had on the whole a charmed life and enjoyed it. I was not depressed or anything. I was slightly depressed after I left the University of Chicago. I had tenure there in economics and history, but decided to leave in 1980. Went to the University of Iowa. But I've never had clinical depression as I've seen it in my sister and in friends who have had it.
Yeah.
I was just kind of sad a bit, but and my marriage was very good. We supported each other. I encouraged Joanne to go on in her career as a nurse, and she got her BS from Simmons College in Boston, then went on to get a master's and PhD, became a distinguished professor of nursing at the University of Iowa. And it was a good marriage. Now, we were both strong personalities, so there's a little argument and tension there, but that's true all marriages.
What do you think you were suppressing during that time, if anything? I know that's a word we've talked about a few times, but there seemed to have been a revelation for you, a personal revelation in your early 50s that you were almost unaware of, it seems. How do you make sense of that?
I was aware of it. I just resisted it. I was aware that if I could have snapped my fingers, I would have preferred to have been born as a woman. I knew that from age 11 on. But snapping fingers wasn't available. And in 1953, changing gender was not available.
Yeah.
And until, quite late, it was viewed as very strange and unusual. As I said, Jan Morris in the 1970s her book called Conundrum taught me, and this was when I was thinking about all this in the early 90s. I mean, not too early, in the 1995 was when I really started to think about it. Her book taught me that you could go on having a serious career and yet change gender, as she did. She was the journalist when she was James, who announced the scaling of Mount Everest from the base camp. And she was a journalist and author. Then she became Jan and continued being a journalist and author. I was willing when I decided in August, decided is not the word, as though you're buying an automobile. When I realized in August of 1995 that I couldn't wait change, my attitude was that I was willing to give up my career and go be a secretary in a grain elevator in Spokane as long as I could be a woman. And for someone as career oriented as I am, that's an amazing statement.
Yeah.
Most of the people who know me were in fact astonished that I had this attitude.
Yeah. I mentioned my friend earlier who I grew up with, who we went to the same church when we were kids. And he later told me that he had an experience pretty much exactly the same as the one you articulated in your book of, for him, asking God to change him, to make him not gay. And there's a scene in your book where you say the same thing. You know,
That's right.
You were praying and asking God to make you a woman.
Well, my joke, and I do this when I give gender talk sometimes. I say when I was 11 years old, I'd fall asleep praying that I would be the next morning I'd be a girl, and that I wouldn't stutter. And I got half of this request, which is then I make the joke that I became at age in 1998. I became not a Catholic, but an Episcopalian. So I got only half of my prayer. If I'd gone all the way to the Pope, maybe I would have got both.
And this is a simple question to ask, but when you lived for 40 years, it sounds like, knowing you wished you could be or would be a woman. What is the lived experience like of that?
It's not quite that. See, that's the thing. Again, this point about being able to work on 2, 3 levels. I had suppressed that in the sense I said, well, you remember the Monty Python, I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. You remember their song about transgender? But maybe you don't. But in any case, I had said, no, I'm a heterosexual crossdresser. I don't want to be a woman. And I didn't understand what being a woman was. But no one understands, in a transition that every one of us has been through from childhood to adulthood. As a child, you don't know what it's like to be an adult.
Yeah.
Yet you want to be. I mean, you say things to yourself like, boy, when I'm an adult, I can have all the toys I want. And some immature adults go on with this theory. But so I wasn't tortured. I wouldn't say, oh, God, I can't be a woman. Oh, life's not worth living, blah, blah, blah. No, I didn't say that at all. I got on with life and love, and I loved my children. I loved my life. I worked hard. I was happy. Now, I'm happier now. Ecstatic would be more like the correct adjective. But and I learned things about what it is to be a woman, a lot of which are expressed in the book I wrote in 1999, Crossing.
Yeah. And I definitely want to get into that. You just used the word ecstatic, and I want to tease that out a little bit maybe later in the conversation. But for just to follow the chronology of your life story, you reach the mid 90s and decide, you want to do something here.
Again, this word decision is a problem, because then you can talk about why you did it.
Yeah.
You can say, well, I bought a Chrysler. Why did you do that? And then you can give various explanations. But for a lot of the big decisions or small decisions of our lives, deciding is not really what happens. I like vanilla ice cream. I don't much like chocolate ice cream. Now, well, why? Why don't you like chocolate ice cream? Now, come on. And the same thing is true of, why do you love the person you love? Why do I love thee? Let me count the ways. How? No, she said, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. Um, why and deciding the way economists talk about it is kind of a silly way to talk about some of the more, well, as I said, a lot of the changes we engage in our lives.
Yeah. What wording would you find appropriate for that
Well,
evolution or for that transition?
I'm not offended by calling it a decision. But, I'm just pointing out that costs. Well, actually, 1 month before I realized that I could and would, in July of 1995, I'm not making this up. I'm an economist. I'm a professor of economics. I drew up a cost benefit analysis of changing gender because I had gone to, in the months before, just in those months, not for years, but just in those months, I'd gone to a bunch of cross-dressing conventions, which are a hoot. I'm telling you, they're really they're very funny. But in any case, I went to those and saw people who were transitioning and so on. I said, well, now let's see. Let's look on this as a decision to buy an automobile. And so I drew up parallel lists of costs and benefits. And, it's idiotic. Stop it, Deirdre. Stop it, Donald. And then I used in talking to journalists about it when I made it public in November of 1995 that I was going to do this. I used the word epiphany, the religious word. Not that at the time I was a Christian, I was not, but I used that word, and the psychiatrists leapt on it because they thought that meant I was crazy, which is kind of irritating. They take religious experiences as evidence of madness. If you say you saw Jesus up on a tree, they're going to think you're out of your mind. So, but it was more like an epiphany than like a, deciding on what, I don't know, think of some uninteresting decision that one makes.
Yeah. And the epiphany, just so I'm clear, the epiphany was, this is something that I want to do. This is a transition
I want to do, that I will do. I was on, I know the place where it happened. It was by the DeKalb Oasis on Route 88 interstate in northern Illinois. As I was coming back from a night of wild fun at lesbian bars in Chicago, dancing, having a swell time, came back the following morning, and by the DeKalb Oasis, it hit me. And I came back, I told my wife, she cried. And at first, her attitude was sympathetic because she loved me. But then in the following months, it gradually hardened, which, I could completely understand that.
Yeah. Do you tend to, I had this reaction when my friend came out of the closet. I had friends who were in favor of it and friends that were not. And do you think that kind of hardening was cultural at the time, or do you think it was something else?
Well, and her friends told her, in divorces, as but by the way, you don't have to get divorced when you change gender.
Right.
The state doesn't have an interest in this, thank God. So in Jan Morris's case, this character I mentioned, she stayed married to her wife. Let's see, I forget the question. What was the question?
Well, the question was the reaction that you were
Oh,
receiving from people closest to you?
yeah. Well, there were very surprising reactions. That's, in the old days, if you were a Protestant and you married a Catholic, that caused great commotion in the families, both families. If you were white, you married a black, as Thomas, the Supreme Court justice, did.
Yeah.
That created a big kerfuffle, and people would stop speaking to you and would congratulate you, and all kinds of mixed reactions. I thought that my mother would have a great difficulty with this, and that my sister, who is a professor of psychology and is a progressive, that she would have no trouble, and it was the other way around. My sister decided I was crazy and started pursuing me with judges and psychiatrists in tow. And my mother took 5 minutes to say, "Oh, well, if that's what you want, dear." And not because she didn't care, but because my mother loved me in a way that wasn't going to be overridden by convention. She was a very unconventional person, my mother, so that's not too surprising.
My understanding is that your sister attempted to have you institutionalized.
Twice. Well, actually, she tried 3 times, succeeded twice. But it makes the book more interesting because the middle of the book is all about Laura chasing me around. And you and I could have committed for observation for 3 days, it usually is said to be. Anyone who is listening to this podcast, you and I don't know who they are. We could say we heard her threatening to commit suicide. And if you can convince a judge of that that's true, the judge will send the sheriff to seize this person who neither of us knows and put her in the madhouse for 3 days. And it usually works out to be longer because the courts are not in session on Saturday and Sunday. So if you do it on Friday, or actually if you do it on Wednesday, it's going to be, or Thursday, it's going to be more than 3 days.
Yeah.
And she succeeded in doing that twice. And boy, is that terrifying, because we all know from the movies about criminal procedure, at least we think we do. And we know that, roughly speaking, if you're innocent, you're not going to go to jail. Whereas with psychiatric things, the psychiatrists have immense and dangerous power over us all. And they can put you away indefinitely. In fact, the main psychiatrist who dealt with me at the University of Chicago Hospital wanted me to not go to the madhouse forever, but wanted me to wait for a year and blah, blah, blah. And he knew nothing about what he was talking about. It was just out of the caution which is bred into psychiatrists as doctors and not into surgeons. So it was a terrifying experience.
Yeah. So much of your story, and I don't know today that we'll have time to talk about your economic viewpoints, but I know you're a classical liberal, and so much of the story of your life, I can understand why. Given the insistence on individual liberty and individual freedom that is based in that general philosophy.
Well, that's not quite how I came. That wasn't why I did it. I mean, some of my friends on the left think, oh, well, she did it because it was cool or to express opposition to gender binaries or something like that. It was not a theoretical decision. It was not about liberalism. In fact, long afterwards, after my change, I'd always been, as you said, not always, but for much of my professional career, I had been a 19th century liberal without being very serious about it.
Yeah.
Serious isn't quite the word, but not being scholarly about it. But in the last 10 years now, in the 2010s, I've gotten very serious about it, and I've written a number of books about it. And but that's after the fact. I see the freedom to be gay or love who you want or be who you want, as long as you're not killing someone else. That's fundamental to liberalism.
Yeah.
It is not automatic in any other political philosophy.
I would love to give you an opportunity. You said this earlier, that your sister attempted to have you institutionalized 3 times and succeeded twice, and you talked about the fear of that, the terror of that. What happened? What do you remember about that?
Well, I remember a great deal. It's all in the book. In the middle period, there were all kinds of crazy things going on. I mean, some of them were funny and most of them were not. But I escaped to California, went to stay with friends in California, economic historians like I was, my specialty, and they were wonderfully helpful because the laws in California were somewhat less oppressive than the laws in either Iowa or Illinois. At the time I lived in Iowa, but the second time she attempted it, it was at the Palmer House in Chicago at an academic conference where my work was being praised. And in the middle of this session, an employee of the hotel came in and said, "Sir," I was in male drag, although everyone by that time knew what I was going to do.
Yeah.
And said, "Sir, you're needed outside." I thought, my God, my daughter's been in an automobile accident or something terrible. I come out, and there's my sister with 2 large Chicago police officers. And off I went in a paddy wagon, of all things, to the University of Chicago Hospital, where I was met by ignorant psychiatrists, a raft of them. So it's not an experience. Well, here's what I say. Every middle-class person should be arrested in life to see what it's like. I mean, you do moderate, nonviolent civil disobedience, and you expect to go to jail. But imagine being accused of a crime falsely. And that's how it felt. It was terrifying.
Yeah.
But it took a number of years, but my sister and I are now close. We traveled together, and I helped her last year move into her new house in Tucson and go through a knee operation. So we're close, but I don't trust her as far as I can throw her on psychiatric matters.
Yeah. I want to talk about now, maybe this is a good transition to talk about, people like your sister. The trans issue just has become front and center in a way that maybe you find surprising. In the last 5 years, you can't go a day on Twitter or a day or a week watching the news without having a trans issue come up.
Yeah.
And maybe a good way to segue this is to ask you about, your sister. I know you just mentioned you travel together. Do you think in general she has, her ignorance has shifted? What do you make of her change in mentality?
She wasn't ignorant. The psychiatrists were ignorant, and she was following the psychiatrists. It was really easy to get psychiatrists to say that someone was crazy in 1995 who wanted to change gender. It was easy as pie. And she was having her own problems, which we needn't go into, but that explain her behavior, I think, more than any ignorance. She's a very intelligent, well-educated person and a psychologist, an academic psychologist, to be sure, but a psychologist. What would happen is this. The chronology is that from the 90s, into the 2000s, things get better and better and better for trans people. All kinds of things change. Anti-cross-dressing laws, which were in the United States about 100 years old, a little bit more, were dropped. It became easier and easier to transition. But as you said, in the last 5 years, especially in the age of Trump in the United States, conservatives, the sort of vicious conservatives, not people like George Will, who's a friend of mine, but the hateful conservatives who call themselves Christians, they have latched onto this as one of the elements of the culture war. You know, hair dyed green, anything you want that they are able to use, they use. And very strangely, it's more virulent in Britain than it is here. In Britain, it comes from the left, not from the right. The so-called TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, TERFs, such as, what's her name? The author of the magic books. What's her name? The incredibly popular children's books. Anyway, Harry Potter. That author, she's a TERF. And, you know, as I debated about a month ago, Kathleen Stock, who is not exactly a TERF, but is very worried about transgender issues. She's a British academic who was driven from the University of Sussex by students who hated her anti-trans views. You see it. It's the opposite of what it is in the United States, so far as the politics is concerned. And she and I have become friends, but we don't agree. And she's, I don't know, she's very frightened by the thought of a person with XY genes being in the ladies' room. And there you are.
Yeah. And I want to get into that because I've had Helen Joyce on the podcast about a year ago.
I don't know who she is. Who's Helen Joyce?
She's a writer for The Economist magazine who wrote a book about the trans ideology movement, also British, actually Irish by birth. Before we get into that, though, I would love...
She's a TERF, is that right? Trans exclusionary radical feminist.
I don't know if she would be grouped into that category, but she knows Kathleen Stock. I think they're of a similar mentality.
Yeah.
But you used the word earlier, ecstatic, to talk about your post-transition life. And I'd love to give you an opportunity to talk about what it is like, what it has been like for you now for more than 20, 25 years to be living as you have.
Well, it's the commonest human experience of happiness. You wanted to be a lawyer. All your life, you wanted to be a lawyer. When you were a child, you wanted to be a lawyer. You saw it on TV. You thought, boy, that'd be great. Then you become one, and you're thrilled. You wanted to be a test pilot, and you become one. You wanted to be a ballet dancer. You become one. It's that kind of experience, and I've had, as we all have had, small or large experiences of that character in other realms of my life. I wanted to be a writer. Now I am. I've written 24 books. I wanted to be a scholar. I am. I wanted to be an economist. I am. I wanted the Nobel Prize in economics. I haven't quite gotten that, but pray for me in October. And so it's the ecstasy of happiness is not about pleasure. Maybe it's pleasure, but look at myself in the mirror. I've had a lot of facial surgery. I look at myself in the mirror in the morning and smile.
Mm.
When I walk down the street, I don't get red anymore. There was a period about a year during my early transition when I was red all the time. People would look at me, and I could tell that they were saying, "Oh, look, there's a man in a dress." I was living in Holland, so it didn't matter as much as it would have in the United States. But now I pass. Even with my voice, I pass. I'm old. My 80th birthday is coming up on September 11th. So I can say, well, I smoked cigarettes and drank a quart of whiskey every day, and this is the voice you get. So it's just the satisfaction is perhaps the better word than ecstasy.
Yeah.
I had a gay friend who lived down the street in our street in Iowa City. And he said to me once, "I thank God every morning that God made me gay." And I understand that.
Hmm. Yeah. Is it a self-actualization for you? You said satisfaction might also work. Is it essentially becoming you?
Well, who's you? That's the trouble with that kind of talk, although it's romantic talk. It sounds very analytic and sophisticated to call it self-actualization, but it's actually romantic, by which I mean I'm an English professor as well, or was. It means the theory of the romantic movement starting in Germany in the late 18th century and spreading, that there's some inner essence of people that they're allowed to express, and then that's wonderful. And as a liberal, I agree with that. But on the other hand, the earlier assumption, social assumption, social construction, social idea was that you are what your social role says you should be. If you're the Duke of Omnium, you're the Duke of Omnium. Mm. And that's who you are. It's not that there's some revelation, romantic, heroic, inner core that you're expressing. It's what you're told to do in the world, and you do it. So I go along with that because I think human flourishing depends on people being able to do what they want to do, as long as it doesn't interfere with the plans of other people. Not the plans, it's not a good way to put it, but the doings of other people.
Yeah.
Interfere isn't quite the word, because we interfere with each other all the time. This is a basic problem in liberalism, because, look, I hurt my wife by transitioning. I don't disagree with that. I did. I didn't intend to. That wasn't my purpose. It was, and she could have reacted the way Jan Morris's wife reacted. And you could say, well, she chose not to. As a girl from St. Albans, Vermont, you can take the girl out of St. Albans, but you can't take St. Albans out of the girl. Okay. We bump into each other all the time.
Yeah.
And that's why, to have a free society, we have to agree at a higher level than just, did something I say offend you? Or did my action irritate you? The economists talk about externalities, that this vocabulary has been going for about 100 years. And the trouble is that everything we do is an externality. If I wear an ugly burnt orange dress. It offends everyone who sees me. So what, should we have a government office like in Iran or Saudi Arabia to prevent me from dressing in a way that won't offend other people?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, we're talking days after Salman Rushdie was just attacked.
Exactly.
Things he said.
Exactly. Or things he didn't say, because the actual fact is that he didn't take the prophet's name in vain. It's the original charge was crazy to begin with. But even if he had, I agree. In Pakistan, if you take the prophet in vain, you're executed.
Yeah. What did you...
Pakistan and Afghanistan. Well, yeah, in Pakistan, you're almost executed.
What do you like most about being a woman?
Friendship. And I had no idea about this as a guy. The quality of female friendship, it's cultural, obviously. It'll vary from one culture to another, but I don't think too much. Women make deep friends quickly and permanently in a way that men have no idea. And I didn't. And, you know, I have lots of superficial and some deep female friends now. And it's not that we're in love or it's about sex or something. It's not. It's about, well, for example, friendship of women is based on the exchange of secrets. This is true of girls, too. Secrets. Whereas with boys and men, it's the sharing of activities. So a couple of men can spend decades watching football on TV together and think of the other guy as their real mate. He's my friend, my deep friend. Yet not know how many children he has and never think that to go to him when they're in trouble. I have had a couple of friends who taught at Berkeley, and the woman said to the man once, "How many friends do you have in Berkeley?" And he said, he actually said, and he's a dear friend of he died last, but he's a dear friend of mine, and they're both dear friends of mine. He said, I have hundreds of friends. I've lived in Berkeley for 30 years. And she said, "You mean you have hundreds of people who will not shoot you on sight?" I guess that's what you mean by a friend. He said, "Well, yeah." And she said, "Well, do you have anyone who you can call in the middle of the night and say, 'I need you'?" And he thought for a moment and said, "No, I don't have anyone like that." So it was the quality of female friendship which just astounded me, and it's a great pleasure in the kind of superficial sense, but also a deep. I think the word satisfaction is best.
Has it been all ecstasy for you, euphoria for you, or have there ever been moments of second guessing or doubt?
No, and about every other decision in my life, especially the one to leave the University of Chicago with tenure, I have doubts. Not too many. I don't doubt much that I married Joanne or that I became an economist or decided to venture seriously into the humanities in the 1980s. All these decisions, changes of path in life, I don't have regrets about. And I certainly, about my gender change, absolutely not. Straight people assume that you would. And that's one of Kathleen's problems about young people, children in particular, deciding to change gender. She says, "Oh, how can they decide?" Well, that's she's wrong about that. But in any case, the you it's let's see, sort of losing the track of my argument here with all its curly cues. The it's a it's a great pleasure. It's not because of the pleasures that you do it. It's satisfying. I forget what the issue is. What's the issue again?
Well, you talked about the clarity that you had about the
Oh
decision.
yeah. But not having, look, all of us, you, me, everyone who hears this, has 4 a.m. doubts, right? My 4 a.m. doubt is about leaving the University of Chicago. That's essentially the only decision in my life that I have serious doubts about. I can make the argument on both sides, staying or going. But anyway, I went. I have never once had a moment of doubt, 4 a.m. or any other time, about changing gender. And as I said, for straight people, this seems, what? Yeah. Of course you'd have doubts because they wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Would you change gender? I take it not. And you're horrified by the very thought that in Iran, if you declare or if you're found out to be homosexual, they force you to change gender. Because that's the only theory they have. Only women love men. So in order to be a homosexual instead of being beheaded, you have to become a woman, which is a locker room theory of the most stupid sort.
Yeah. Yeah.
It confuses whom you love with who you are.
Yeah.
I love my dogs. I've had lots of dogs in my life, and I've loved them all. That doesn't mean I want to become a dog.
Yeah. You mentioned Kathleen Stock earlier, and I mentioned Helen Joyce. And I think before we dive in here, I think just personally, as someone who's watching this from the outside, one of the things that I appreciate about you and your affiliation with the University of Austin and the way that you seem to conduct yourself as a public intellectual, as someone who's putting their ideas out into the public realm, is your insistence on freedom of speech being paramount. And I think we are all attempting to, or most of us, I think, are attempting to have a good faith understanding of what the rational and ethical perspective is on trans issues that are numerous. And I know that one of the issues that you already mentioned this, that you and Kathleen are friends but disagree, and that is a lost art in my from my perspective of people that are kind of intellectually in the arena. And
I have many socialist friends.
Yeah.
Most of my academic friends, deep friends whom I love, are socialists, one sort or another. I was a socialist once, so I kind of understand where they're coming from. But I don't hate them because they don't agree with my politics.
Yeah, I know one of the key points that Helen has made, I think Kathleen probably made in your public debate that that you were mentioning earlier, is that her concern was about kids having access to permanently irreversible changes that they could make to their bodies in a way that might sterilize them.
It's a completely silly argument. Here's why. I can give you about 10 responses to it. Here's one. It's not irreversible. How do I know that? Gee. Here's someone who changed gender at 53.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not irreversible. So stop nonsense. Yeah, some parts of it are irreversible. You're sterilized. Well, lots of people are sterile for one reason or another. And so far as decisions are concerned, decisions are made about children and by children all the time that are really irreversible. If you, as I know people, I have relatives who are this way, who when they were young, when they were adolescents, refused to be academically successful. They didn't work hard in high school, even though they had extremely high IQs. Now, I'm not going to name these people, but they know who they are. Hmm. They decided not to study. And they decided it. It's not something that, it was inevitable, because then they have sisters and brothers who went along with the routine of doing well in high school and then doing well in college and going to college. That's completely irreversible. And I can show you the results. Becoming an alcoholic, and I've known plenty of those in my family on my mother's side. There are lots of alcoholics. Experimenting with drugs, driving cars fast, decisions to bring your children along when you're in the army and you're moving a lot. That's a kind of childhood that's sometimes good for people and often bad for people, because every 3 years they move somewhere else. Completely irreversible. It has psychological effects. So come on, what is this? What is picking out this one and saying, oh, we've got to have laws against that? So I just regard that argument with contempt, as you can see. Now, when I'm arguing with Kathleen, I try to be polite, but it's a silly damn argument. And to say that these kids don't know what they're doing. Now, I wasn't like this, as you pointed out earlier. I came to this desire, which I then suppressed at age 11. A lot of kids, some girl from age 2 will be saying to her parents, I'm a boy. I'm not going to wear those damn dresses. Don't give me any cars. Any dolls. I want trucks. I want to play with the boys. How soon am I going to grow a penis? I'm a boy. I'm a boy. I'm a boy. And this is rather common. It's much more common than people thought it was. Well, what do you do with such a person? It's cruel not to allow him to be him. It's child abuse. Whereas in the state of Texas, it's now been determined by law that it's child abuse to help him. So the argument is, it is based on fabulous numbers that are completely phony. That these people, Kathleen's an honest scholar, and she would be she wouldn't agree with what I'm about to say, but it's based on a fairy tale about how many people regret it. I've never met a transgendered person, and I know a lot of them, who has regretted it. Never once. And I know 100 of them. So, well, I don't know, maybe there's some sampling bias that I don't realize. Whereas Kathleen and this other character you mentioned, they claim, oh, no, it's very common. People regret it all the time. What a lot of nonsense.
We're all trying to figure out the truth here, right? And that I didn't know any of this information before talking to Helen.
Well, it's not information. It's fairy tales, dear. Much of it is. And you shouldn't just accept anything you read in the newspapers or everything you read in the newspapers or see online. She's got a lot of things wrong, believe me. And if she and I sat down together, and you were listening, you'd hear some of the things that I think are wrong. But the arousal of hatred against transgendered people is the cost of this. It's now look, I don't go along with the students at the University of Sussex said, "Oh, you're arousing hatred against transgendered people. I want you fired by the university." I absolutely am against that. But think of the analogies. White people said, "Black people are terrifying and criminal. I don't want them in my neighborhood." Men said, "It's appalling to suggest that women should have the vote. That would be scary and terrifying and awful." Jews were treated as vermin in Nazi Germany, as terrifying, a secret conspiracy against good people. And on and on and on. Every time this homosexuals, you know this. I think you're old enough to remember straight panic about homosexuals. So if some gay guy approached you personally, you were authorized in the 1950s and 60s to kill him. No court in the land would convict you out of sheer irrational fear. Now, as a boy who hitchhiked a lot in the days when you could, I was approached by homosexual men, not all the time, but frequently. And I said, no, that's all. I wasn't raped. I wasn't. Kathleen has this vision of men sneaking around in ladies' rooms. I mean, Jesus, to perform rape. A rapist is going to rape and should be stopped regardless of where he is. The idea that he would get dressed up in women's clothes in order to rape people is just ludicrous. So there's a tremendous number of straight fear, irrational, backed, the TERFs say, by data, which they make up.
The claim, I mean, the just to be candid, the claim that I think I found most persuasive, and you very well may be correct about this, I'm open to changing my mind, was the claim that the majority of the children who were deciding to have these procedures ended up regretting it later in their life.
That's complete nonsense.
And if they are wrong about that, how are they so wrong? How are they because by analogy with fear of blacks or Jews or women or foreigners or whatever, they've been aroused, and they look. People believed Donald Trump's fairy tales about the what they call it, the mob. It wasn't the mob, some other word they used, the caravan of people from Central America approaching our southern border. I have a cousin who believed all that, who thought that they were mainly carrying drugs and were violent people. It's just, people believe a lot of stuff that ain't so. That Josh Billings, a contemporary of Mark Twain, said, "It ain't what you don't know that hurts you. It's what you know that ain't so." Yeah. Yeah. And is it your view that, if they are incorrect about this, that it has been wholly fabricated? And
no, it's not fabricated in the sense that they said, "Now let's see, let's make up some fake facts." No, they believe it. They think it's true. They believe what the columnist in the London Times says. They believe this stuff. It's not insincere. I wouldn't accuse Kathleen of being insincere.
Yeah,
and they're seriously worried, and that's why I draw the analogy with these other irrational fears. The fear by Southern men that black men were after their women which, as you know, was a deep anxiety that justified lynching.
Yeah.
And understand, the TERFs and Kathleen are focused on the children, and I'm all for making sure that the children are helped as much as we can. Although understand, most of the decisions we make about children are never second guessed by the rest of the society.
Yeah.
Most of the way you were raised had nothing to do with child. It was not. It wasn't the state bureaucracies who told your parents to do that. Whereas what Kathleen and her friends want to do is bring in the state to intervene in child raising in this particular respect. No other respect. You don't read to your child when they're small, they won't become readers later in life. There's probably some scientific proof of that. I just asserted, but I think it's true.
Yeah.
If you don't read, Good Night Moon to your 3-year-old, you're not going to end up with a reader at age 12. Now, that is an irreversible damage to the child. So let's propose an office of child reading with secret police who break into your house at the time when your children should be going to sleep according to the state, and make sure you're reading to them.
Yeah.
Right?
Not to harp on this too much, but just to get to the genesis of, let's say all of these, public intellectuals like Helen, like Kathleen are wrong. And I don't know if this is the case, but perhaps it is, that they're all parroting an article that you just mentioned may have been in the Times. Is there a
London
the London Times? Is there a clear, a clear genesis for a study that they are now all parroting?
Why should it be this way, dear? Why should I have to prove that this particular intervention in child raising, where some girl, as some ex child, has been saying since she was 2 years old that she's a boy, and her parents in their kindliness allow her to go to school as one, and the school is tolerant about this. Why should I have to defend that piece of child raising, whereas all the other supposedly, it's not even irreversible, but all the other definitely irreversible things that parents do to children, for good or evil, are not a state responsibility? Why should the state be involved? Why should the state of Texas have a law, as it does now, against helping children choose the gender they want? I mean, I just don't see. It's weird in the sense. Look, here's an analogy. The supposedly Christian opponents of homosexuality choose 2 verses in the Hebrew Bible and 1 in the New Testament, and hang all their analysis and hatred of homosexuality on those things. Now, ask yourself, there are, 615 commandments and prohibitions in the Hebrew Bible. Is it 615? Something like that. Why aren't these people Orthodox Jews? Why don't they separate meat and milk? Why don't they have ritual baths after their periods? Why don't they go to the shul? Right? if you understand the analogy,
I
they're
do.
picking out one thing which they don't like. Well, the TERFs are doing exactly the same thing. They're picking out one item among the various things, and we've all been children. We all know about this. The various good things and bad things. My great virtue is that I chose the correct parents, but they choose this one thing, and then they want to bring in the state.
Yeah. I know we're getting somewhat short on time here, so I'd love to give you an opportunity to talk about maybe one or two final
Sure.
subjects. But from your perspective, what is the state? What is the country? What is just the correct philosophy in general to have about these subjects? Obviously, this is a very touchy subject for a lot of people, and it gets people extremely emotional. It's part of the reason why I enjoy talking to people like you one-on-one in depth, because I feel like that is just personally my preferred way of learning. And
you mean the trans issue?
The trans issue, yeah. What's the right path forward here
the right path forward is to leave people alone. The right path forward is no slavery. The right path forward is no masters. That's the core of liberalism.
Yeah.
As devised rather suddenly in Northwestern Europe in the 18th century. This theory that Thomas Jefferson famously articulated, this man who owned slaves, some of whom were his children, all men are created equal and are endowed by their blah, blah, blah. That theory, Adam Smith is my big hero on this, but John Stuart Mill and Mary Wollstonecraft and Voltaire and all these people said slavery is bad. And the great first triumph of liberalism in politics was the abolition of slavery.
Yeah.
Actual slavery. And then slavery by analogy, not even very far, not even a remote analogy, the slavery of wives to husbands, until the Married Women's Property Act in Britain in 1874, you as a wife were absorbed into your husband. All your property, including your children, went to your husband on marriage. You could own thousands of acres of farmland, and he would, the instant you said "I do," he would own it. He would own it. He could sell it and do anything he wanted with it. That's slavery. All kinds of slavery. Until the 19th century, it was conventional to beat everyone. Sailors were beaten. Horses were beaten. Children were beaten. Wives were beaten. People were beaten all the time. And then in the 19th century, under liberal laws, gradually we stopped beating each other to punish, to subordinate people.
Yeah. That's
the core of this issue. Leave people alone. Don't suppose that the government, I'm sure that you don't think, and I certainly don't, that the state of Texas knows better than the average parent does what to do for children. I mean, it's almost crazy to suppose that those people in Austin know what they're doing. They don't on anything else. I don't know why they would suddenly get wise on this gender issue. So it's liberalism. It's another way to express it is adultism. That's a word that I'm peddling these days. That free adults, and this includes parents, should be allowed to do what they can harmlessly do. Now look, sexually abusing children, beating them, right, as was perfectly acceptable, really until the 20th century in the West. Now it's illegal to spank your child. Is now in lots of states of the United States is illegal. It's against the law. Whereas the idea spare the rod and spoil the child was conventional thinking right up to the time I was raised, although my parents didn't do it. So those are my views.
Yeah. I think regardless, I just want to say how much I appreciate your openness of sharing your story. You write about this in your book that,
Uh-huh.
I think you felt like in your 50s that this was your opportunity. And I think you had kind of a religious view of this to be an example and to share, to
Well,
be,
I decided to. When I sent around an email in the early days of email to all my colleagues, telling them what I was going to do. I sent about 100 of them to my colleagues at the University of Iowa and in my professional life. I kind of naively thought that that would be the end of it. But then a reporter from the Des Moines newspaper called me up, said, "Well, I have this document of yours." And I decided on the spot that as a full professor of economics and history with a secure tenure, if I didn't speak up, that would be shameful. I mean, I wasn't some assistant professor on a yearly contract or something. Look, when I was young, I was against the Vietnam War, but I didn't do anything about it. I was against the laws against homosexuality, but I didn't do anything about it. I was in favor of the women's movement, though I was an excellent husband and encouraged my wife. I didn't sacrifice anything to the women's movement. When the gay movement came up, I had correct ideas in my view, but I didn't do anything about it. Then God tapped me on the shoulder in 1995 and said, "Okay, dear, here's your last chance to hang your life upon a truth," as a Latin poet expressed it.
mm,
And I said, "Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. I'd better hang my life upon a truth." So I haven't become a professional gender changer, so to speak. But I'm mainly a scholar, an economist and writer, and that's what I do. But I felt I had to stand up to people like what was his name? I always call him George Bailey, but that's not what he was. Michael Bailey,
mm,
a professor of psychology at Northwestern University, who wrote a terrible book called "The Man Who Would Be Queen," which merged homosexuality and gender changing in this locker room theory.
yeah.
And I declared against him. And when journalists call, the only bad story I've ever gotten was a little squib in Harper's Magazine back in 1995, where some idiot journalist made fun of, or 1996, made fun of the fact that I had come to the American Economic Association convention as Deirdre. All the rest of the time, I tell my story. I've been on the cover of the Chronicle of Higher Education as Deirdre. All the other stories have been, whether they're trans, well, they're all, they're all human beings, and they all understand human plans and desires. And I've had excellent press, I have to say, but I didn't expect that. I expected to be, as I said, I expected to lose my job.
Yeah.
But I had to. That or be nothing. Say, "Oh no, it's a private matter. Oh, I'm afraid to talk about it. Oh, I can't do that." Yeah, well,
It seems to me that you were uniquely positioned to put some skin in the game and to be
Yeah,
able
that's
to
right. I should have, on this, I hadn't put skin in the game about these other things that I claimed. I was in favor of the civil rights movement. I grew up in a democratic household. But I didn't do anything about it. I have friends who went down to South Carolina in the summer of 63 to register voters. Well, that was dangerous.
That takes some courage.
It really took some courage, and I didn't do it.
Well, I really respect the courage you have demonstrated, and I just want to personally thank you for all of the time. I really hope we get to meet in person at some point.
Good.
I would love to continue the conversation, but
Certainly.
thank you for doing this. It was a real pleasure to meet you and to be able to hash this out and to talk in such detail. So
okay,
thank you so much.
Okay, I've enjoyed it too.
Likewise. Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you're finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show via the links below on Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon. Your support helps to make these conversations possible.